Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in New Mexico. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the winter of 1891, in the remote plains west of Taos and north of Socorro, an obscure family by the name of Hollister acquired a parcel of land that lay just beyond the farthest ranches. The deed described desert tableland with a shallow arroyo and a stone-lined cistern well, but neighbors whispered that the well was deeper than seemed possible and cursed. The Hollisters, newcomers from further east, sought isolation and privacy. When they arrived, caravans of wagons creaked under loaded trunks. Their children, a boy and a girl, trailed behind with suitcases and trained mules. The sky was heavy, spring storm clouds gathering in distant mountains. The first letters from the Hollisters to the county clerk included survey plans, water rights petitions, and a short, cryptic line, "We may need more than law to settle this ground." The clerk, one Elias Wren, stored the envelope in loose bundles decades later, though some of the maps were lost. In town they were a curiosity, strangers in somber clothes, pale and too quiet. Rancher Henry Cabot, whose holdings lay 3 miles east, recalled seeing a single lantern blinking beside the well at midnight. "It might have been the wind flickering, or their servant," Cabot wrote in his ledger, but the light stayed too precise, too unmoving for natural wind. Over the next months, the Hollisters purchased more acreage. They fenced their boundaries with split wood and wire. The well, though stone-lined, was never fully cleared in daylight. Workers sent to measure its depth never returned with consistent figures. One claimed 50 feet, another 80, yet one later journal noted bottom unknown. The family patriarch, Jonathan Hollister, insisted they had struck a subterranean spring and hailed it as a promise of water in the arid land. But local whispers said otherwise. Some called it the Hollister Pit, saying it swallowed livestock, devoured echoes, even hummed at night. In neighboring counties, murmurs of Las Gorras Blancas had spread by 1890, as dispossessed ranchers and farmers in New Mexico territory fought land speculators. Wikipedia, some speculated that the Hollister land had been claimed under disputed Spanish land grant boundaries, claims the vigilantes had opposed. The alignment of folklore around land, water, and betrayal made the hollow well rumor seem darker than mere frontier drama. By fall of that year, the Hollisters applied to the Territorial Water Board in Santa Fe, citing drought conditions and urgent need of rights to their well. A petition by local residents protested, claiming the well lay on contested grant boundaries and might disturb buried remains known in old oral histories. The territorial clerk's office returned the petition marked "under further review." Unbeknownst to the Hollisters and the neighbors, the echoes of old conflicts from the Lincoln County disputes still stalked the territory. The old feuds between rival ranchers, the tensions that had flared in the Lincoln County War decades earlier, echoed in remote corners of New Mexico. The history of ambushes, water disputes, and prosecutorial intimidation. The spring thaw of 1892 came late to the mesas, and when it did, the well by the Hollister homestead overflowed for a day before sinking back into silence. Neighbors took it as a bad sign. Water in that part of the territory never rose unprovoked. The family's hired man, Samuel Rigg, left abruptly that April, telling the blacksmith in town, "There's something down there that talks when no one's awake." His words were written down by a reporter from the Santa Fe New Mexican, but the article was later retracted, supposedly for lack of corroboration. County assessor files show that Jonathan Hollister paid taxes promptly, but stopped attending town meetings. His wife, Eleanor, rarely appeared in public after June. What letters survive in the courthouse archive bear stains from damp storage and a tone of unease. One line, addressed to a reverend case in Socorro, reads, "The water changes hue. We hear a rhythm at night, as if someone were walking the stone rim." The reverend never answered, though a local priest, Father Cordova, later claimed to have visited the site. His testimony, entered into diocesan notes in 1895, mentions an unnatural cold from within the earth and the impression of breath without body. Travelers passing the property at dusk began to notice lights again. Soft amber glows around the well, sometimes moving, sometimes still. Some believed the Hollisters had installed lanterns to keep watch for intruders. Others whispered it was Goras Blancas sympathizers exacting revenge for land misdeeds. The Las Goras Blancas movement had fractured by then, yet stray members were rumored to wander the frontier, righting imagined wrongs and vanishing without a trace. The name reappears in a single deputy's report, noting hoofprints leading to the Hollister gate and none leaving. By late summer, the youngest Hollister, a boy of 9 named Thomas, was reported missing. The father claimed he had gone to fetch a bucket and never returned. Search parties combed the arroyo, finding only the boy's shoes near the well. Witness accounts differ. One said the shoes were damp, another that they were brittle with dust, but all agreed on a single oddity. The bucket rope hung straight, rigid, as if pulled taut by some unseen force below. Sheriff E.C. Albright ordered the well covered with planks, pending investigation. For 2 weeks, the homestead lay silent. Then a stage passenger named Gertrude Lane swore she saw smoke rising from the Hollister property, where no fire burned. Her affidavit mentions a column of gray-like dust, but without wind, lifting from the well mouth. When the sheriff returned, he found the boards pried up and the well open again. The Hollisters themselves were gone. House deserted, animals unfed, papers scattered. A ledger found under the dining table held several entries in Jonathan's hand. The last dated October 2nd, 1892. The ground will not keep still, the depth alters when measured. The official inquiry began on October 12, 1892, when Sheriff Albright deputized 2 ranchers and a territorial surveyor to document the abandoned Hollister property. The report, preserved in fragments at the Santa Fe Territorial Archive, describes the scene with dry precision. One dwelling of pine board construction, 26 by 18 feet, furnishings overturned, no sign of forced entry, well uncovered. What follows reads less like a sheriff's report and more like field notes from an engineer. Lowered a stone tied to rope, struck bottom at uncertain measure, rope frayed, resonance inconsistent, as if chambers beneath. At sunrise, the men noticed the surrounding soil depressed in a perfect ring, 3 paces wide, as though the ground had settled around the shaft. One rancher, Levi Kendrick, testified that he felt vibration like distant thunder, though no cloud in sight. Albright dismissed it as wind in the rock hollows. They sealed the well again and posted warning stakes, but by the next morning the stakes had toppled and the planks lay split. Back in town, Reverend Case collected parish donations to search for the missing family. His journal, later found among diocesan effects, notes that he carried a small silver cross, for comfort rather than ceremony. He recorded entering the Hollister home on November 5th and finding a child's drawing nailed to the pantry door. Crude stick figures around a black circle, the caption reading, "Down is home." No one claimed the drawing afterward. The paper disintegrated within a decade of storage. That winter was harsh, and territorial news was filled with unrest. Lingering disputes from the Las Goras Blancas era, still unsettled ranchers whose boundaries overlapped the old Spanish grants. Case wrote that some locals blamed the Hollisters for awakening something buried during earlier conflicts, perhaps an unmarked grave from the land war, versus others, more pragmatic, believed a sinkhole had opened into forgotten mine tunnels. In January 1893, Albright received a letter postmarked from El Paso bearing only a signature, J. Hollister. Inside was a fragment of scripture and a sentence. The water is clean again, but not for drinking. No one could verify the handwriting. The sheriff filed it under miscellaneous. Yet 2 weeks later, freight men heading toward Socorro claimed they saw a figure matching Jonathan Hollister's description standing near the tracks at night, holding a lantern wrapped in oilcloth. When they approached, the man turned, raised the light once, and disappeared beyond the embankment. The following month, structural tremors struck parts of Valencia County. Some wells collapsed, others emitted sulfur odor. Geological inspectors from Santa Fe concluded that subterranean erosion and gas pockets were responsible. Still, Sheriff Albright wrote in his closing note, "I cannot say with assurance the Hollister case is closed. The well breathes." Locals avoided the site for years. By 1896, the cabin was gone, reclaimed by wind and scavengers. A single foundation stone and the well rim remained. Children called it the Cursed Mouth, daring each other to shout into it at dusk. By 1898, curiosity had replaced fear in certain circles. The Hollister property, once whispered about as a cautionary tale, had become a point of strange attraction for those drawn to the margins of the frontier. Newspapermen, amateur geologists, and a few speculative investors who imagined some hidden mineral fortune. Among them was Elias Pruitt, a correspondent for the Albuquerque Morning Democrat, known for his meticulous descriptions of abandoned homesteads. His first dispatch, dated April 9, 1898, read simply, "The house is gone, but something remains that exhales cold." Pruitt's article never ran in full. The editor cited its melancholic tone as unsuitable for spring publication. But carbon copies of his notes survived, rediscovered decades later in a collector's estate. They describe the terrain in detail: brittle sage, broken fence posts, and at the center, the circular well rimmed with sun-bleached stones, each engraved faintly with initials. Pruitt traced a few, JHEH, and an unfamiliar MC, perhaps one of the hired men. He measured the depth with a chain and wrote, "Echo not consistent, soft in places, hollow in others, smell of iron, faint but distinct." His second visit was accompanied by a photographer named Samuel Twigg. The plates were damaged in development, streaks, cracks, chemical burns, but one print endured, showing what appeared to be a shadow across the well's mouth, though no figure was recorded in their notes. Twigg refused to return after that, claiming he heard the sound of shifting stone when the air was still. Pruitt, however, seemed captivated. In his final report to the paper, filed in May, he compared the site's atmosphere to the abandoned Spanish missions described in the histories of Las Gorras Blancas, where land strife and superstition mingled. "It is as if those quarrels," he wrote, "sank into the soil and became restless." By midsummer, county surveyors again listed the property as unclaimed. Yet that same month, the territorial marshal recorded a trespassing complaint filed by a ranch hand near San Miguel. The witness said he saw a man dressed like the old settlers, drawing water from a bucket rope and talking softly to himself. When hailed, the man turned and vanished into heat haze. The hand could not explain how there was water, that season's wells were near dry. Weeks later, Pruitt's horse was found tethered near the Hollister site, reins neatly coiled. The man himself was gone. The paper printed a brief notice: "Correspondent missing while on field work near Socorro." No follow-up appeared. Locals began to mark the ground with crude crosses. Ranch wives said their husbands returned from the mesa speaking slower, as though listening inwardly. The county map of 1899 omits the Hollister tract entirely, not sold. In 1902, a new settler family named Caro arrived from Texas, unaware of the property's reputation. County officials, eager to repopulate the remote districts, sold them the Hollister tract for almost nothing. A legal fiction, since the title had long since lapsed. The Caros built a simple cabin of pine and adobe against the windbreak of mesquite, never suspecting that the depression near the arroyo was anything more than a dry cistern. The eldest son, Luke Caro, later described their first months in a surviving letter to his cousin in Amarillo. "The ground is clean and quiet, but the air at night makes one think of low bells underfoot. We sleep sound. Mother says she dreams of water." Neighbors soon warned them of the old name attached to the place, the Hollister Well, but frontier pragmatism left little room for superstition. Luke lowered a bucket once, drawing up clear water, cold enough to mist in the summer heat. The family drank from it through August. By September, the livestock refused to approach the rim. Chickens stopped laying. The youngest child, Anna, told her mother that she saw faces in the puddles after the rain. The mother scolded her for fancy talk, but 2 weeks later a pail was found split clean in half beside the well, as though from frost. though the air had not dipped below 60. A territorial hydrologist, Dr. Raymond Coulter, was summoned from Albuquerque in late autumn to study what the papers called a bottomless artesian feature. His report, preserved partially in the Geological Society records, describes a shaft descending through alternating layers of volcanic tuff and limestone. Coulter noted, "Depth beyond 75 feet uncertain. Echo suggests open chamber below, water pure by chemical test, yet bearing odor of iron and sulfur combined." He recommended sealing it, citing instability, but the Caros ignored the warning. 2 months later, in early 1903, the youngest child vanished. Snow lay heavy that week. Searchers followed small footprints toward the well, stopping where the earth was smooth and undisturbed. Sheriff Miles Pritchard recorded in his notebook, "No sign of struggle, no depressions, only stillness." After that, the Caros left. The father sold his stock for half price and rode east. The cabin stood vacant within a month, stripped by scavengers and dust storms. By 1905, the site had reclaimed its silence. That same year, a territorial history lecturer at the university in Santa Fe gave a talk referencing the property, noting that its location overlapped boundaries from disputes once patrolled by Las Gorras Blancas. "Perhaps," he said, "some quarrel over water rights left memory in the soil, the kind that does not fade easily." His audience dismissed it as metaphor. Yet a traveling photographer who passed through that winter captured a blurred exposure of the well under moonlight. In the negative's corner appears a faint vertical shape, pale and motionless, like someone standing watch. The photographer annotated. In the early spring of 1907, a small research expedition from the Territorial University of New Mexico set out under the guidance of Dr. Raymond Coulter, the same hydrologist who had examined the Hollister site years earlier. He returned not for curiosity, but under the pretext of cataloging unique subterrestrial formations for a geological bulletin funded by the Santa Fe Territorial Council. His student assistants, Martin Valdez and E.F. Coleman, recorded meticulous notes now stored in the university's special collections, labeled Specimen Site 14. According to Valdez's journal, the team arrived to find the area nearly erased by sand and mesquite. Only the top stones of the well remained visible, bleached and loose. They cleared debris and attempted to measure the shaft. Coleman later wrote that their line descended freely for 82 feet before catching on something soft. When pulled back, the rope was damp and left a metallic residue. Not water, he noted, but black film, oily and odorless. They camped nearby for 3 nights. On the second night, one assistant reported hearing faint rhythmic sounds, as of a man drawing water in intervals. The others dismissed it, yet Valdez recorded in his personal field book that the sound stopped whenever someone approached the well and resumed once they retreated. Among the papers later found in Coulter's effects was a single folded diagram titled Subsurface Cavity, Possible Vent. It described a hollow at roughly 90 feet, shaped irregularly like a lung or twin basin. In his annotations, Coulter referenced the case of the Las Gorras Blancas disturbances of 1890 to 91, noting how underground irrigation tunnels once collapsed in that same region due to clandestine digging. He speculated that the Hollister well might connect to one of those lost irrigation channels or abandoned mine shafts. Yet one marginal note written in haste hints at unease. No trace of construction. Stones at depth appear older than settlement. Too even, too intentional. Before the expedition concluded, Coulter ordered a final measurement. Valdez and Coleman lowered a brass weight sealed in a glass jar for water sampling. When retrieved, the jar was gone, rope severed. Frustrated, they packed up at dusk. That night, Valdez claimed to see movement near the old Caro cabin remains, a tall outline, human-shaped, still as timber. In the morning, they found large depressions in the sand leading from the cabin site to the well and ending abruptly at the rim. Coulter filed his report with minimal comment. In the closing line, he wrote, "Further study unwarranted. Local reluctance and structural hazard prohibit continued excavation." That summer, a thunderstorm struck the mesa. Lightning hit near the well, fusing sand into glass and scattering the top stones. When townspeople visited weeks later, they found a shallow crust of translucent slag where the rim had been, as if the heat had sealed it. For a time, the legend faded. Still, the Hollister tract remained uninhabited. Travelers crossing the plain after nightfall often described seeing a low shimmer, like. By 1910, the Hollister tract had turned into a curious footnote in the borderlands folklore journals. The New Mexico Antiquarian Society listed it briefly as an unverified artesian phenomenon near the Ghost Mesa district. Its obscurity might have persisted had it not been for a soft-spoken ethnographer named Dr. Harlan Mott, whose interests straddled anthropology and superstition. He believed that what the locals called the Cursed Well reflected older Puebloan traditions of singing ground, where sound was said to travel beneath the soil like wind through reeds. Mott arrived that autumn with a mule cart of notebooks and a single phonograph cylinder recorder. His assistant, a Pueblo interpreter named Miguel Ortega, kept a parallel field diary later discovered in his grandson's attic in 1940. Ortega's first entry describes their approach. Ground baked and silent, no grass moves though air passes. Dr. Mott walks slow, as if the earth were a library. They pitched camp near the fused rim left by lightning 3 years before. Mott's intention was simple: record the ambient resonance at the site for comparison with desert wind frequencies. Yet his early observations already betrayed discomfort. On October 5th he wrote, "Sound below is not mere echo. It repeats rhythm not present in the call." Ortega corroborated. When he struck the rim with his boot heel, there came an answering tone lower than thunder. That evening, they recorded for 30 minutes. The resulting cylinder, labeled Specimen Number 9, played back with faint knocks spaced evenly, then a single drawn-out hiss. Technicians at the university dismissed it as mechanical friction. Mott, however, insisted on taking another recording at midnight. The second cylinder shattered in its tin case before playback. When the men prepared to leave, they found shallow prints surrounding their camp, round, symmetrical debris. Eschains as if made by heavy boots sunk halfway into dust. Mott photographed them, though the plate developed overexposed. In the margin of his field notebook he penciled, "Same circumference as man's step, but deeper by half." Returning to Santa Fe, Mott presented his findings at the Territorial Historical Club, invoking again the Las Gorras Blancas conflicts. He suggested that buried irrigation tunnels from the land-grant wars might still shift beneath the mesa, producing acoustic illusions. Memory, he told his audience, is sometimes geological. Few listened. The minutes record polite applause and no funding granted. Months later, a janitor cleaning the archive basement reported hearing a muffled tapping near the wooden crate that held Mott's equipment. The crate was moved upstairs, after which the noises stopped. Mott himself left for Arizona soon after and never returned to the territory. Ortega's final diary line reads, "He said the ground keeps accounts of what is owed." By the time the Great Drought of 1911 reached northern New Mexico, the well's location had nearly vanished under sand. Only the shimmer of fused glass marked its center. Yet travelers still told of hearing a dull metallic beat rising from the plain whenever storms came. The drought of 1911 scorched nearly every arroyo and grazing flat between Santa Rosa and the Pecos. Ranchers desperate for water began revisiting abandoned wells, and so the Hollister site, long forgotten under dust, drew attention again. Two brothers, Caleb and Ezra Dent, itinerant herders from Socorro County, found the fused glass circle by accident while trailing thirsty cattle. They thought it the remnants of a burned cistern and began to dig. Their spades broke the surface easily, but after a foot of powdery soil, the ground turned rigid, greenish, translucent, almost like cooled slag. Ezra wrote later in a letter to his cousin, "It was not stone nor glass, but both, hot to look at, cold to touch." They chipped at it for half a day, exposing something metallic beneath. When they pried it loose, the object proved to be a small iron bucket, handle warped into a corkscrew, its sides fused with sand. Inside, half encased in brittle residue, lay something resembling cloth, woven fine, striped blue and white, like the patterns used in shirts of the 1890s. Caleb swore he saw a letter stitched faintly in thread, an H, or perhaps E word spread fast. The local paper in Vaughan printed a brief notice on July 23rd. Artifact recovered from Hollister well, possible remains of lost homestead. Within days, speculators arrived, claiming rights to the tract under a new Homestead Act. They found nothing more of value, only the same hardened basin and the faint smell of iron. But that smell clung to tools and clothing for weeks afterward. One prospector burned his gloves, saying it was like holding a thunderstorm. The county surveyor dispatched a team to verify the dense find. Among them was Deputy Recorder Anna McCurdy, one of the few women in the territorial office. Her field notes, remarkably detailed, describe a curious optical distortion around the exposed slag. Heat shimmer ins, cool air, compass needle erratic, horses nervous within 20 yards. McCurdy concluded the anomaly was caused by magnetite veins melted during lightning strikes, a natural phenomenon. Yet she added a private remark in parentheses. Sound beneath ground persists, rhythmic, perhaps echo from own heartbeat. The artifact was sent to Santa Fe for analysis, but the crate never reached its destination. The freight manifest shows it loaded on the stage out of Vaughan and missing upon arrival. No trace found. Rumor held that a university collector purchased it quietly, though no museum ever displayed such an item. That winter, the Dents left the territory. Their nearest neighbor reported that before departing, they filled the shallow pit with stones and crossed 2 mesquite branches over the spot like a grave marker. Afterward, rain began falling again, the first in almost 2 years. Old ranch hands joked that the ground, having been fed, finally released the clouds. In folklore circles, the Hollister well was again whispered of, half relic, half warning. A small pamphlet published in Santa Fe in 1913, Frontier Oddities of the New Mexico Territory, mentioned it under Sites of Uncertain Nature. By 1915, the territory had begun to hum with the sound of industry, railroads pushing south, telegraph wires glinting in the sun. The region near the old Hollister tract had been mapped anew for a railway spur meant to connect small ranching towns to the main line between Vaughan and Socorro. To the survey crews, it was just another stretch of hard country, wind-burned and indifferent. To the locals, it was ground better left untouched. The survey camp was led by engineer Robert Calhoun, a pragmatic man whose journals rarely strayed from numbers and gradients. But his notes from July 18, 1915, show an uncharacteristic unease. Camped near abandoned well depression, marked by fused stone, compass bearing inconsistent, iron filings drawn to earth as though magnetized, instruments unreliable after sundown. Calhoun and his men, 3 assistants and a hired guide, set up their transit within 50 yards of the glassy basin once called the Hollister Well. Their aim was to measure soil density for track stability, but on the second evening, tremors rippled across the plain, gentle at first, then sharper, enough to rattle the transit legs. The guide, a veteran cowboy named Mace Delgado, spat and said, "That's no quake, that's something breathing." Calhoun laughed it off, but his laughter sounded forced. Later he logged, "Ground pulse timed at roughly 12 seconds between intervals." That night, while taking star bearings, the youngest surveyor, Eli Barker, swore he saw motion within the dark center of the basin, like a shimmer of wetness or reflection, though no moon shone overhead. The others dismissed it as fatigue, but Barker would not sleep near camp again. He moved his bedroll half a mile away. In the morning his instruments lay scattered, their metal surfaces covered with a fine reddish dust that smelled faintly of blood and iron. 2 days later, they discovered a hose. Below beneath the crusted surface, a cavity perhaps 6 feet deep and lined with a strange smooth film. Calhoun described it as vitreous, like the residue from smelting. He lowered a chain to test for deeper layers. At 40 feet, the chain jerked as though caught, then slackened. When retrieved, The end links were warm to the touch. The discovery alarmed him. He ordered camp broken and moved north to safer terrain. That night, while loading equipment, the telegraph operator at the nearest relay station received a fragmentary transmission. Mag field unstable, light in basin, evacuate. The message cut off mid-word. No reply ever came through. When a relief crew reached the site a week later, they found the instruments stacked neatly, tents collapsed, supplies untouched. No sign of struggle, no footprints beyond the first ring of glassy soil. The official report listed the men as lost in a sandstorm event. Calhoun's field journal, later recovered by a passing cattleman, ended with a single unfinished line. Subsurface tone identical to that described by Dr. Mott in 1910 phonograph test. It was the first formal linkage between the scientific expeditions that had come before, a clue that the well, or whatever lay beneath, produced a measurable vibration consistent through decades. In the following months, a few railroad workers refused to camp near that stretch, calling it the ringing field. When locomotives later crossed the completed line miles away, engineers sometimes reported odd compass interference and flickering gauges when passing the nearest point to the Hollister land. One telegraph operator described it best in a letter to his wife. It's like the earth remembers a sound and keeps trying to repeat it. By the close of 1916, drought ended, and the story again fell silent. But silence in that part of New Mexico had... When the Great War ended in 1918, the frontier quieted only briefly. New Mexico, now a full state, saw returning soldiers drift through its towns, men seeking work, solitude, or simply a place where memories couldn't follow them. Among them was Dr. Emery T. Lowell, a physician once attached to an Army field hospital in France. His experience with shell shock had turned him toward strange curiosities of the human nervous system, what he called resonant afflictions. In a letter to the Santa Fe Medical Review, Lowell described hearing of a basin in the Central Plains where metal instruments lose alignment and the ground hums faintly under calm skies. He wrote that it might present a natural laboratory for studying the interaction between magnetism and human perception. By the spring of 1919, he had traveled by rail to Vaughan, then by hired wagon to the very edge of the Hollister Tract. What he found was desolation, no vegetation higher than the ankle, the same fused bowl of greenish glass described years earlier. The air shimmered in waves, though the temperature barely grazed 70. Local ranchers refused to accompany him beyond the first dry arroyo. Lowell camped alone, setting up a medical tent with tuning forks, a field magnetometer, and a small phonograph for recording. His field diary, preserved in fragments at the New Mexico State Archive, begins methodically and ends in disjointed half-sentences. April 16, 1919. Slight oscillation in compass. Hum audible only when one is still. Pulse increases at proximity to basin. April 18th. Tested fork at 440 cycles. Vibration persists after contact ceases, though air remains motionless. April 21st. Attempted rest. Dream of depth without bottom. The impression of water whispering beneath iron skin. That same week, 2 prospectors traveling east toward Fort Sumner reported seeing a lone man at dusk, standing beside a white tent in the basin, holding a stethoscope against the earth. He looked like he was listening for a heartbeat, one said later. They camped 10 miles away and heard faint metallic ringing through the night, as if from underground bells. Lowell's equipment was found weeks later by a freight hauler. His tent still stood, flaps tied, instruments neatly arranged. The physician was gone. Only his boots remained, one upright, the other toppled near the rim. The magnetometer needle pointed downward and would not reset. When the items were sent back to Santa Fe, the lab clerk recorded a curious side effect. Proximity to instruments causes faint tinnitus. Ears ring for minutes after handling. The lab sealed them in a wooden crate labeled Medical Apparatus. Do not test. Around the same time, local farmers began complaining of headaches and livestock restlessness within a few miles of the site. Newspapers speculated about underground gases or volcanic tremors. Yet a few who had read Lowell's brief essay whispered of something else, a resonance that affected not the ground, but the mind. One article in the Albuquerque Citizen, dated August 2, 1919, summarized the speculation under the headline, "The Doctor Who Listened to the Earth." Dr. Lowell claimed that certain soils remember trauma, that vibrations from past violence can remain, like heat in cooling metal. It was a poetic way to phrase what science could not explain, but it echoed something older. The veterans who passed through Vaughan that autumn said the same thing about France, that the fields there still trembled when the wind was right. And so the Hollister site slipped once more into rumor, folded now into post-war melancholy. By 1922, the expanding land reforms of the new state demanded fresh surveys. Counties sought to convert old, unclaimed tracts into taxable property, and the Hollister land, absent from maps for nearly 30 years, was redrawn under the name Parcel 48C, Vaughan District. The engineer in charge, Thomas Grady, was a modern man, skeptical of folklore, but even he noted that the soil there held a peculiar stillness, like a held breath. The team consisted of 4 men and 1 local laborer, Jose Padilla, who had herded sheep nearby since childhood. Padilla warned them before the first stake went down. "Señores, that ground doesn't stay the same size from day to day. Measure it once, and tomorrow the distance changes." They laughed, chalked it up to superstition, and began clearing what remained of the fused basin. After 2 days of work, they discovered that beneath the crust, the soil had hardened into concentric rings of discolored sand, black, red, and pale yellow, like the layers of a burnt tree. On the 3rd day, while driving an auger, the bit struck metal. They excavated carefully, revealing a rusted box, perhaps 2 feet long, its lid warped shut by heat. Grady pried it open with a chisel. Inside lay small personal effects: a folded wool bonnet, a corroded revolver, and several fragments of paper sealed in wax. The top page, though singed, bore a faint ink scrawl in an elegant hand, E. Hollister. Another scrap read, "Keep the rope sealed. The water answers when called by name." The surveyors dismissed it as a hoax planted by locals, but Padilla refused to touch the box again. He claimed to hear a hum like bees coming from inside. Grady wrapped the contents and sent them to the county office for cataloging, though records later show they never arrived. Somewhere between Vaughan and Santa Rosa, the courier wagon was overturned by wind, and the parcel van ished into the dust. A few weeks later, the survey resumed. Grady recorded strong magnetic interference on his instruments, compasses turning in slow circles, levels trembling without touch. In frustration, he hammered an iron stake into the center of the basin to mark its position for the official map. Within hours, the stake tilted as if the earth itself had exhaled. That night, the crew camped nearby. Sometime before dawn, one of the men awoke, shouting that someone was walking around the tents, bare feet dragging in the sand. The others saw nothing, but the prints were there in the morning, deep and perfect, circling the camp and leading toward the well site. Grady noted them in his field report, but added a dry remark: "Likely prank of locals." Still, the next day, none of the crew would return to finish measurements. Padilla refused outright, and by evening the project was quietly abandoned. Parcel 48C remained blank on the finalized 1923 state map, an anomaly in an otherwise precise grid. Months later, a clerk in the Santa Fe land office claimed he received an envelope containing one of the Hollister papers. No return address. The note inside read only, "The water is not gone, it waits." The handwriting, though smudged, was compared by a historian decades later with signatures from the 1890s deeds. The result was inconclusive, except for one unsettling detail. The ink, tested chemically, contained trace elements of iron. During the 1930s, as the Great Depression swept across the nation, New Mexico became one of many regions visited by the Federal Writers Project, part of the Works Progress Administration, WPA. Their mission was simple: collect oral histories, folklore, and regional ghost stories before they vanished with the older generations. Few expected that one of those field notebooks would reopen the file of the cursed well of the Hollisters. The assignment fell to Clara Vaughan, a young ethnographer from Santa Fe who had studied under the folklorist Dr. Stanley Fielding. Her focus was borderland superstitions and rural tragedy. In May 1936, she arrived in the Vaughan district, traveling by bus and then by mule to the small ranching settlements scattered near the mesa. The old-timers called her La Señorita de los Cuentos, the Lady of Stories, and most were happy to talk, though some lowered their voices when the Hollister name arose. Her notebook, preserved in the WPA archives under Field Unit 7B, opens with this line: "The people here still speak of the well as though it breathes. They call it El Pozo que Canta, the well that sings." She interviewed José Padilla, the same man who had assisted in the 1922 survey. Now white-haired and stooped, he recalled the metal box they had found, describing it as hot, even in the cold wind. When Clara asked what became of it, he only shook his head. "Se lo tragó la tierra," he said softly. The earth swallowed it. Padilla claimed that after the survey, several men who worked the site suffered ailments, migraines, tremors, one losing his hearing completely. "They said it was dust sickness," he told her, "but no one else on the plains caught it, only those who heard the hum." Clara visited the site herself on May 17th. Her field entry reads like poetry and pathology intertwined. No structure remains. The basin glows faintly under full sun, a sheen like old pewter. I felt a pressure in the ears, as if descending under water. The mule refused to approach within 40 yards. That night, she camped in a nearby arroyo and recorded notes by lantern light. On the following page, her handwriting wavers. Around midnight, a low vibration, steady, not wind. It rose and fell in cycles, sounded not through air but through ground. The mule brayed once, and would not be calmed. I packed by dawn. She later interviewed Doña Isabella Montoya, aged 92, who as a girl had known of the Hollisters. Montoya described the family's arrival, the strange well, and the disappearance of the boy Thomas. Her voice, captured on a wax cylinder, trembled as she recalled the aftermath. When they covered the well, the wind stopped for 3 days. Then came a smell like burnt sugar. My mother said the ground had taken its payment. Clara included these transcriptions in her final report, submitted to Washington in 1937. The federal editors deemed it of regional interest, but withheld publication, citing its unsubstantiated supernatural elements. Her notes were archived, forgotten in a gray box labeled Folk Tales, unverified. But locals remembered the woman who had come asking about the singing well. In later years, they said she left changed, quieter, distracted. A shopkeeper in Vaughan claimed she returned months later, bought several coils of rope, and asked where she might find the old Hollister stones. She was never seen again in the territory. 2 decades later, when her materials were finally catalogued, archivists discovered a slip of paper tucked between pages. In faded pencil it read, "Water in darkness, voice in eye." By the summer of 1939, New Mexico was gripped by drought again, the last severe dry spell before the war years. The state's Public Works Department, already stretched thin, approved small federal funds to deepen and reclaim dormant wells for local use. The Hollister tract appeared on a faded survey list as abandoned water source, possibly artesian. To the bureaucrats in Santa Fe, it was a harmless entry. To the few locals who still whispered about it, it was an omen. The crew assigned to the task consisted of 3 WPA laborers, a foreman named Frank Redding, and a hydrologist from Albuquerque, Professor Daniel T. Meade, known for his rationalism and short temper. Meade considered the stories coward's talk and set out determined to prove the site's normal geology. He brought with him a portable drill, a steel tripod, and 2 weeks of supplies. The journal fragments later found among his effects begin briskly. June 12, 1939. Arrived site. Air unusually still. Soil at basin crust hard, fused, light green-gray color. Instruments behave erratically near center. Compass needle trembles. Magnetic meter registers steady pulse. June 14th. Drilled 6 inches through crust. Subsurface sand dry, packed. Odor faintly metallic. Assistants report mild nausea, wind absent. Shadows sharper than normal. The laborers, Harris Cole and Santiago Ruiz, were simple men used to desert work, but after 3 days they asked to leave. Ruiz claimed to hear voices echoing through the drill pipe when it struck certain layers. "Like someone whispering my name from under the wheel," he said. Meade chastised him and continued the work alone for 1 night. When the others returned the next morning, the drill lay twisted beside the hole, its metal warped as if from extreme heat. Meade was seated nearby, dazed and incoherent. He repeated a single sentence over and over. "It's breathing again." The men carried him to Vaughan for treatment. Doctors diagnosed heat stroke and exhaustion, but his hands were blistered in a curious pattern, thin circular welts across the palms. The report never reached the capital. That evening, the remaining crew returned to dismantle camp. They noticed the soil where the drill had been was no longer level. It had sunk slightly, perhaps 3 inches. When they poured sand to fill it, the grains swirled and disappeared. Ruiz described the motion later as like water down a drain, but slower, like it wanted to be seen. By nightfall, lightning gathered far to the north, and the men left in haste. The following morning, local ranchers riding past found the entire depression blackened, as though scorched from within. The drill head, which had weighed several hundred pounds, was gone. Professor Meade recovered enough to write a single formal note to his department before leaving New Mexico forever. It read, "Magnetic interference, not explainable by any natural field. Subsurface activity rhythmic, possibly harmonic. Recommend site sealed and stricken from hydrological records." His request was granted. The Hollister tract was omitted from subsequent state surveys and designated geologically unstable. Later that year, a minor clerk tasked with updating the water registry added a quiet comment in the margin of the file. Local superstition advises burial of iron near the rim to keep the ground from calling back what's beneath. I did not inquire further. When war clouds gathered overseas, America turned its eyes elsewhere. The story of the cursed well faded once more into the dust. But the last WPA truck driver to pass the area swore that his tires. By 1943, war production had transformed New Mexico into a landscape of airfields and proving grounds. The desert, once seen as barren, now served as a perfect canvas for testing engines, radar, and flight endurance. From above, the land appeared endless. Brown waves of sand and brush broken by the occasional glint of metal. Among these glints, one began to draw quiet attention from the Army Air Corps training pilots out of Clovis Field. Flight cadets practicing long-range navigation reported a strange flicker on their compasses whenever they crossed a stretch roughly 10 miles west of Vaughan, near what old maps labeled Hollister Mesa. The reading swung wildly for a few seconds, then steadied. Instructors chalked it up to instrument error or mineral deposits. But when it happened again and again, always above the same patch of ground, the base's engineering officer filed a short memorandum. Magnetic deviation consistent at UDG 47 SSW of Vaughan. Duration 5 to 9 seconds. Altitude variable. No one at the base realized the coordinates corresponded to the forgotten basin sealed 2 decades earlier. That spring, a reconnaissance pilot named Lieutenant Henry Porter was assigned to photograph terrain for new training charts. Porter's logbook, later found among declassified records, describes his flight on April 2, 1943. Visibility excellent, 10:45 hours, altitude 3,200 feet.
Camera jammed while crossing Vaughn sector. Heard brief hum through headset. Not radio interference, more like resonance. Plane instruments fluctuated. At 10:46 hours, shadow observed below. Circular, darker than terrain. Diameter, approx. 40 and 50 feet. Shape consistent with crater. Porter's plane returned safely, but when the film was developed, the frame from 1046 showed an irregular dark ring with a faint inner glow. Technicians blamed light leakage. The negative was filed away under damaged material.
2 months later, a mapping team sent by the Army Corps of Engineers attempted a ground verification. Their report, unclassified only in the 1970s, mentions a shallow basin containing fused glass-like material, origin undetermined. The crew set up a temporary magnetometer. The readings were erratic, pulsing at steady intervals. The youngest technician, Corporal Alan Reeves, noted that the device's rhythm sounded like a slow heartbeat when amplified through the speaker. The next morning, Reeves refused to continue, claiming he had heard metallic knocking under the ground while sketching the rim. His superior reprimanded him, but the team packed early. In the addendum to their field notes, the commanding officer included one line: "No further interest, area of no strategic value." The Hollister site was once again struck from official charts, this time under military order. Years later, an airman stationed in Clovis recalled hearing a local mechanic joke that there's a spot out west that scrambles a compass worse than whiskey. The man laughed, then added more quietly, "But you can hear it hum when you fly low, like a wire under tension." What no one knew was that during that same year, Dr. Daniel Meade, the hydrologist who had gone half mad during the WPA dig, was living in seclusion outside Santa Fe. His private correspondence, discovered only after his death in 1946, contained one final note about the Hollister land. "They are listening from below again. The airfield boys will hear it first." It was never mailed. By the war's end, the Hollister tract had been fully absorbed into government mapping grids, yet on late-night flights over that portion of the desert, a few seasoned pilots claimed their altimeters dipped inexplicably. When the war ended, New Mexico changed forever. The desert that once echoed with the clatter of wagons now hummed with military engines and classified experiments. By 1946, the name Los Alamos carried an aura of secrecy and awe, and many small anomalies across the state were quietly revisited under the pretext of geophysical research. One of these was the unmarked depression west of Vaughn, a place a few men still called the Hollister Basin. The first mention of renewed interest came in a confidential memorandum from Dr. Alton Reeves, a young physicist recently transferred from Oak Ridge. Reeves had encountered a minor but persistent irregularity while charting magnetic fields across the southwest. Sector 47B, he wrote, displays an oscillation in magnetic flux inconsistent with geological composition. Recommend physical verification. His supervisor approved a short expedition, 2 trucks, 5 men, and 1 geologist from the University of New Mexico, Professor Helen Armitage, an expert on volcanic glass. They arrived on March 11, 1947, and set up instruments near the center of what looked, to all eyes, like a shallow crater rimmed with sunburned sage. The first day's readings were normal. The second day brought something else. At approximately 2:14 p.m., the magnetometer needle began to swing rhythmically, every 13 seconds, in a pattern Reeves later described as pulse-like, self-sustaining. He thought of electrical interference until he noticed the generator had been switched off. Armitage, pragmatic and calm, collected samples of the fused crust, noting it bore characteristics identical to trinitite. The green glass formed at the Trinity nuclear test site a year earlier, but the location lay far from any blast range. "No evidence of heat fissures, no vitrified debris beyond the ring," she wrote. "Effect localized and ancient." That evening, camp. Cook Peter Hansen swore he heard tapping beneath the truck's wheel wells, soft, measured, metallic. Reeves dismissed it until he too heard it while adjusting the magnetometer cables. "It's like Morse code," he said. Armitage replied, half joking, "Perhaps the Earth is answering back." The next morning, the team awoke to find faint circular impressions surrounding their tents, pressed into hard sand, each about the size of a dinner plate. No footprints led toward or away from them. Reeves photographed the marks, but when developed, the negative showed a faint, luminous ring overlaying each print, like phosphor traces. On March 14th, the team decided to end the study. The instruments were packed, samples labeled, and the site recovered with sand. Reeves filed his report quietly, titling it Magnetic Field Irregularities, Sector 47B. In a private letter to Armitage a month later, he admitted he hadn't slept well since their trip. "I keep hearing that slow vibration at night. It's not sound, it's memory. You feel it in the bones before the ear." Armitage's reply was terse but sympathetic. "Maybe what you felt isn't still happening, it's still echoing." Neither scientist returned. The official analysis concluded the readings were caused by a localized iron deposit. Yet curiously, when the samples reached Los Alamos for testing, one piece of the green glass was missing. Reeves insisted he had packed 3. Only 2 arrived. Weeks later, an engineer at Los Alamos reported finding a sliver of green material on his workbench with no identifying label. When he touched it, he felt a faint warmth, like a pulse. The sample was discarded. For years afterward, survey planes over the region continued to report brief compass interference. Locals, by then accustomed to strange stories since the Trinity explosion, folded the old Hollister tale into a new language of science. The cursed well became the magnetic pit, another mystery in a state that now birthed its share of them. And yet the old ranchers said the By the early 1950s, the desert skies of New Mexico had begun to fill with stories as much as aircraft. The crash near Roswell in 1947 had already transformed the state into a magnet for speculation, and by the time America entered the atomic age, every flicker of light or odd vibration beneath the ground was seen through a different lens. Radar domes rose from the mesas, soldiers camped where ranchers once herded, and rumors multiplied. Amid that new mythology, the Hollister Basin slipped quietly from forbidden well to restricted test site. The first modern mention appeared in a mimeographed newsletter circulated among amateur skywatchers, the Frontier Observer, in its January 1952 issue. There exists west of Vaughn a circular depression where compasses spin and light instruments malfunction. Locals claim the area has been sealed since 1891 after a series of disappearances connected to a settler family named Hollister. Most readers dismissed it as another Roswell offshoot until a traveling reporter, E.R. Dennison, decided to visit. His article, "The Hole That Hums," ran in the Albuquerque Tribune that March. He found nothing alien, only the familiar ring of fused sand, now half buried and glittering like slag. But his description carried a strangely reverent tone. "The air around the basin has no temperature. Stand there long enough, and your heartbeat seems to match something below." The piece might have been forgotten, yet within months a small team from Sandia Laboratory contacted Dennison privately for his coordinates. Officially, they were studying electromagnetic anomalies that interfered with radar transmissions. Unofficially, one technician later confided to a local sheriff that the instruments picked up a pulse stronger than any subsurface ore deposit should give. From there, the Hollister site entered Cold War rumor. Truck convoys were said to arrive at night, headlights covered, leaving by dawn with tarpaulin-covered crates. No one knew whether it was scientific equipment or superstition they were hauling away. A Vaughn resident, Mrs. Helen Dupree, recalled in a 1970 oral interview, "They said the Army was fixing to build an antenna out there, but I saw the ground glow blue that summer. No antenna ever came." By mid-decade, the basin's coordinates vanished entirely from public geological maps, replaced by a blank square labeled Federal Reservation Land. Locals took it as confirmation of something hidden. The news stories grew stranger, of low sounds heard through car radios when parked nearby, of headlights dimming, of soldiers warning travelers to turn back. One man, a retired pilot named Carl Morton, told a researcher years later that he flew over the area in 1955 on a clear afternoon. There was a ring of white dust like chalk, he said, and in the middle, something shiny, maybe water, maybe glass. Then my altimeter went dead for 30 seconds. He never filed an official report. Too many stories of airmen grounded for fatigue. The folklore split along two lines. The scientists blamed magnetism and leftover ordnance. The locals whispered that the well had finally reached the attention of men who could hear what it was saying. In Vaughan, old-timers still preferred the older version, that the Hollisters had awakened something beneath the earth long before any laboratory arrived. By the decade's end, new fences surrounded the region, marked with government warnings. Aerial photos from 1958 show no structures, just the same circular shadow, a faint glint in the center, and long vehicle tracks leading away. Yet ranchers noticed that cattle avoided that patch entirely. The animals would walk a mile around it even when driven straight. And so, while the world obsessed over flying saucers and atomic seconds, Reese, one of the oldest mysteries in New Mexico, settled into quiet containment. The cursed well had adapted to a new age. It no longer needed belief, only. In 1963, long after the fences were erected and the Hollister land had vanished from maps, a graduate student at the University of New Mexico stumbled upon the story again. His name was Dr. Peter Langford, then a doctoral candidate in anthropology, studying regional patterns of myth persistence. While combing the WPA archives for Depression-era folklore, he discovered Clara Vaughan's missing field notebooks, the same ones describing El Pozo que Canta, the well that sings. Langford's interest was academic at first. He believed such legends revealed how rural communities expressed collective trauma. But as he read through Vaughan's notes, the tone of her entries changed. Precise descriptions of magnetism, vibrations, and dreams written in a clinical hand that grew increasingly uneven toward the end. On one page, her final sentence stood out underlined twice. It isn't superstition if the earth itself participates. Langford decided to trace her journey. Using county plats from the 1920s and aerial photos from the Geological Survey, he pinpointed the general coordinates west of Vaughan. The area was still fenced but unguarded, labeled simply as Unclaimed Desert Testing Range. In June 1964, with permission to study regional folklore, he set out alone with a jeep, a tape recorder, and a real microphone. His field diary, recovered years later, begins cautiously. June 9th. Arrived at coordinates. Fused ground present, faint green-gray luster. Compass spin confirmed. Low-frequency hum audible through tape mic, though not to ear. June 10th. Recorded for 40 minutes. Playback reveals steady tone at 17 cycles secs. Not wind. Increases slightly every 12 seconds. Could be interference. The next day, Langford recorded at night. The resulting tape became infamous decades later among archivists who finally heard it. It began with desert stillness, insects, a soft wind, then, faintly, a deep, rhythmic throb, not mechanical but organic in tempo. After 40 seconds, a thin metallic rasp entered, almost a voice, and a single word emerged through distortion. Below. Langford labeled it environmental interference, but in his field journal, he scribbled a single line beneath. Same pulse as Hollister ledger description, 1892. The ground will not keep still. He returned twice that summer, once bringing a geologist and once an audio technician. The technician refused to stay past dusk, claiming the microphone cable dragged itself toward the pit. The geologist collected samples of the fused crust and noted they were not volcanic and not man-made. Glassified silicate with uniform alignment requires heat in excess of 3,000 degrees, but no melt pattern outside ring. Langford's dissertation draft from 1967, titled Resonant Landscapes, Folklore and the Memory of Matter, blended anthropology, acoustics, and local testimony. The university rejected it as non-disciplinary. He rewrote the final chapters into a shorter article for a folklore journal, but it was never printed. The editors claimed the sound recordings interfered with magnetic tape machines in their office, demagnetizing nearby reels. Langford left academia soon after, and retreated to a cabin near Taos, where he continued to receive letters from rural residents reporting earth songs or magnetic winds. In one letter dated February 1968, he mentioned traveling back to the basin to leave something there. A recorder, maybe myself. The letter was never mailed. Years later, a prospector discovered his abandoned Jeep 5 miles from the old Hollister site. The keys were still in the ignition. Inside the glove compartment was a sealed envelope labeled Specimen Tape Number 9. The reel was blank, except for 45 seconds of silence, followed by a faint echo that seemed to mimic breathing. By the early 1970s, the Hollister Basin had drifted into the gray border between myth and missing paperwork. The war, the tests, and the Cold War secrecy had left behind so many fenced tracks that one more forgotten circle of fused glass meant little. Yet the story never truly vanished. In the Vaughn Cafe, truckers still spoke of that quiet mile where engines hesitated. A geologist from Roswell named Dr. Ellen Draper tried to relocate the coordinates after hearing of Langford's disappearance. She found only shifting sand and rusted fence wire. Draper's field report, dated April 3, 1971, describes the same oppressive silence others had noted for nearly 80 years. No wind, no insects, no animal tracks. When I stamped my boot on the crust, it rang as though hollow. A single crow flew overhead and would not cross the center. She took 2 photographs. In the first, the ring gleamed faintly. In the second, taken seconds later, the light vanished, leaving only her own shadow stretching toward the center. The negatives showed a faint blur, a gray smear shaped almost like a column of mist rising from the ground. Draper labeled it lens flare and closed the case. That same year, a retired telephone technician in Vaughn wrote to the New Mexico Historical Review recalling an older rumor, that the original Hollister well had been dug atop a shallow spring near an abandoned Spanish land grant once disputed by Las Gorras Blancas in the 1890s. Those men fought over water, he wrote, and maybe water keeps the argument. The editor published the letter in the local section, footnote number 137, in an issue few ever read. By 1975, the last government marker at the site had fallen. A single warning post lay half buried in the dust, its lettering eroded to a ghost line, danger, magnetic field. Ranchers occasionally found bits of green glass after storms, smooth and curved like bow. Little shards, though thicker. Some used them as paperweights, others tossed them aside, saying they hummed faintly when held too long. An aging Jose Padilla, interviewed one final time before his death, told the researcher who visited his nursing home, "I think they filled the well wrong. You don't bury a voice. You teach it to sleep." He smiled when he said it, as though repeating an old prayer. In 1978, a graduate intern cleaning the Santa Fe archives uncovered a box mislabeled Miscellaneous Hydrology, 1891 to 1939. Inside lay a single folded letter, water-stained but legible. The ink had turned rust-colored. It read, "To whomever tends the record, if the well still sings, do not answer. The water remembers, and remembering is enough." E. Hollister, the archivist, logged it without comment. The letter's paper, tested decades later, proved to be from the late 19th century. No one can say whether the Hollister well remains sealed or merely sleeping beneath the shifting plains. Pilots still report brief magnetic flares near Vaughn. Hikers sometimes hear a low vibration through their boots and blame freight trains that never come. Every few years, a storm clears the mesa and someone claims to see a faint circle of glass, catching moonlight like a slow breath. And in certain archives, if you play the old recordings from Clara Vaughn's cylinders or Langford's tapes, a faint rhythm still appears beneath the hiss, a pulse steady as a heartbeat, patient, unending. Perhaps it is only the earth settling. Or perhaps, as the locals still whisper, it is the well calling home what it once took. Wikipedia reference for video description. Las Gorras Blancas. a 19th century group of New Mexican ranchers and laborers active in the 1880s-1890s, whose land